Partial funding for the operation of this channel is provided by the City of Oceanside.
This program brought to you by the caring hands of Tri-City Medical Center.
Welcome to the Voice of Oceanside. Natural disasters often lead us with the feeling, can I be more prepared? Well, today we have with us Chris Chauncey, who's Director of Marketing for Be Ready Incorporated. And he's with us to discuss the possibility of the disaster that's most likely to impact here, and that's an earthquake and how it will affect us. Chris, thanks for joining us on the Voice of Oceanside.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You know, in thinking about this show, it came to mind that this is one of those shows that you frequently see after it's too late, after there's a disaster and everybody is trying to recover from it. We're going to try and do this in the order it should be done, before the disaster.
Exactly. Well, we live in a world today where there's ongoing disasters on a frequent basis, which keeps it more in the forefront of our thinking. But it's interesting, we live in earthquake country here in Southern California. Earthquakes are a common occurrence, and as a result, sometimes we put it in the back of our mind. It's been said that Southern Californians deal with the earthquake threat by living in denial. They deal with it when it actually happens. But the current threats that we have, that we're facing today with the San Andreas earthquake, for instance, and several other faults and tsunami threats, it's no longer an option or a luxury we have to put it off and not think about it. So the old adage, ignorance is bliss, doesn't fall into play here for us anymore.
You know, it's also interesting that there's a little bit of a negative feedback or ineffective feedback loop. We don't think about it, it doesn't happen, we go, we got through that one, which I guess is okay for some natural disasters. If they don't happen in a given year, that doesn't increase the chance of them happening in the next year. But that's not true with earthquakes, is it?
Well, exactly. I'm from the Midwest, Tornado Alley, and you never know year to year how many tornadoes you're going to experience. But unfortunately here, the longer we go without an earthquake, the more likely it is and the greater the percentage of probability that we're actually going to experience one. And we actually have earthquakes that happen all up and down the coast and all over Southern California on a regular basis, but they're very small magnitudes. So we do have earth movement on a regular basis, but anything over a 6.0 magnitude becomes a little more serious. And with that, we haven't had one like that for some period of time. So to quote a seismologist from Los Angeles, he said, the longer we go without a large earthquake, the more nervous I get.
Now, well, if he's nervous, I'm nervous then. Now, I know your approach is to be very specific and address real specific issues, including you're going to take us through fault by fault.
Exactly.
And let's start with the Rose Canyon fault.
Okay. The Rose Canyon fault basically starts in San Diego. Parts of it actually go right along the 5. And right in La Jolla, it actually elbows and takes a turn into the ocean and then follows up along the coastline. We actually have a map of it. And on that map, it shows where the actual detour takes place. And then from there, it continues to go north until it connects with the Newport Inglewood fault. And those two actually become one long major fault. That's significant for a number of reasons. Number one, the longer the fault line is, the longer the shaking is going to take place and the greater the seismic activity. For instance, right now, the southern portion of the Rose Canyon fault could rupture actually any day. That one, we haven't seen one here. The Rose Canyon fault actually hasn't ruptured since 1933 when it ruptured up in Long Beach. And that was the single deadliest disaster in U.S. history. And a lot of it had to do with the way people reacted to the earthquake. Most of the people that died in that earthquake actually ran outside of the buildings. And that's one of the first things they tell you not to do. But it's an easy reaction. Once an earthquake starts, you can watch people run everywhere. I've seen video footage of people outside that start running. And I'm always thinking, where are you going to go? There isn't any place to run to specifically, but it's a knee-jerk reaction when you're nervous. So you don't run outside of those buildings when an earthquake starts. We'll talk more about that in another segment, but
yes, and by the way, one of the things viewers should know, we're going to do a follow-up show on what to do and what not to do and get very specific on those issues as well.
Exactly. So that was a 6.7 magnitude earthquake that was up in Long Beach. And if our entire section from the point of San Diego to the point where north of us it connects with the Newport Englewood fault, we would see a 6.7 as well. If it came only to a stretch of, say, Del Mar, from San Diego to Del Mar, it would be a 6.4. The same thing if it was from our stretch up to the other part of it, up to Newport Englewood. So depending on what stretch of it actually ruptures and how long it goes, the longer the shaking and the greater the magnitude. Now, for a lot of people, we see in the world today, Japan had a 9.0 magnitude, and that was devastating, and we've seen a number of those, actually 4 since 1900. So when we see these large scale earthquakes, we think a 6.7 isn't that big of a deal, especially considering Southern California is much more prepared for earthquakes than other countries are. So that's why we don't see as many casualties as a result of a large-scale earthquake. But
now, when you talk about preparation, there's the local individual preparation, which we're going to cover in our show. Are you referring to things like long-term issues like building codes and infrastructure?
Exactly. As a matter of fact, as a result of the deaths that occurred in the 1933 Newport Englewood rupture, that particular earthquake, they came out with specific codes. It was because of that earthquake that we now have the earthquake codes that are established. A lot of buildings have been retrofitted. Anything that is more in that 1930 category and before that has been built does stand a chance of being completely demolished in a large-scale earthquake, a 6.5 or greater, for instance, or a San Andreas shaking that's anticipated to be a 7.8. So those things have to be taken into consideration. But coming back to the 6.7 category, which is what we're expecting, we had a 6.7 back in 1994 with the Northridge earthquake. And that one was so small, that's such a small fault line, they call it a blind slip fault. They didn't even know it existed until it ruptured. And it only lasted 20 seconds, but yet it was the single costliest disaster in U.S. history. It did a lot of damage. The 10 freeway was broken up in several locations, along with the bridges that were attached to that. So they have tried since that particular earthquake, since Northridge, to even retrofit as many of the freeways and the roads as they possibly can to help withstand greater magnitude earthquakes.
Okay. So what you're telling us then is that we're really only hearing half of the story when we hear that Richter number. And that's what we focus on all the time. So there's 6.7s and then there's 6.7s. And that the other key number is the length of the fall. Exactly. And the one that impacts us in North County is one of the longer ones?
It's longer in comparison to Northridge. Okay. It lasted 20 seconds. You're going to see this one last much longer. There's not an expected time frame because it could start or stop at any particular point along the fault. But the important thing to know is it's only 3 miles offshore from us. So for those of us that live in Carlsbad and Oceanside, for instance, we're going to feel a significant amount of shaking. And older constructed buildings will go down as a result of that, just like we saw up in Long Beach and again up in Northridge. So if you have a newer constructed building, you stand a chance of less destruction or you'll see a lot less of the buildings actually coming down.
And does it tail away as you get down closer to San Diego?
You mean as far as the magnitude goes?
Well, the distance.
Well, it starts down in San Diego and works its way all the way up into the Long Beach area. Becomes one particular fault line.
Okay. How critical is it to be concerned about the fact that it's offshore? Do we have a tsunami effect to look forward to? If that's probably not the right term.
Yeah, tsunami effect?
No,
well,
look forward to it.
Within the Rose Canyon fault, you won't see a tsunami generated from it. One of the questions that's often asked is, will we see a tsunami if we experience a rupture from the San Andreas, for instance? And the answer is no. It's not close to the shoreline. What happens is, if we take a look at Japan, for instance, one of the reasons that a tsunami was generated there was the kind of fault that's experienced up there, and that is called they call that a mega slip fault, where basically what happens is where the two tectonic plates connect, it actually pushes underneath. One pushes itself underneath the other one. And so from that, there's a tremendous amount of seismic activity, and as a result of that, there were large-scale tsunamis. On our shoreline, for instance, here, they sent out the warnings to Hawaii, for instance, and along our coastline once that tsunami was started. They did get impacted in Hawaii. They weren't that large, but they still hit. They did also hit in Northern California. But we have, in our particular area here, kind of a protection mechanism. We have offshore here in our area, we have several banks and also islands. And these particular banks and islands were actually created from fault activity. Earthquakes generated, for instance, we have the Catalina Island, and other ones, the San Clemente Island. Those particular islands were generated from earthquake activity. So these particular banks actually provide a safety mechanism for us that we will not be impacted by these distant, faraway type tsunamis. If we had one from Japan, or we had one from Hawaii that was generated, as the water goes over each and every one of these banks, it actually takes the energy away from the tsunami. So the likelihood of it having any impact by the time it hits our shoreline is extremely minimized. Now, we do have, as a result of these offshore faults, not the Rose Canyon, but the other offshore faults that we have right off our shoreline, for instance, we have several fault lines that have these banks, and the banks in and of themselves can generate a tsunami if the fault line were to rupture right where those particular banks are. Now, we have a video, if we can see the video, and that particular video shows us what these landslide tsunamis actually look like. And what happens is, with the rupture of that particular fault line, the landslide will be created from that particular embankment. And as it slips down into the ocean, it generates the wave and motion activity where it pushes the waves actually upward once the downward movement is finished. And those particular tsunamis rush to our particular shorelines. That's the threat that we experience. And the video that I wanted to show deals with Papua New Guinea, for instance. In 1998, they had their shoreline, by the way, is very similar to ours along our coast. And so we will experience something very similar to the tsunami that they had that killed roughly about 2,200 people. And they had a landslide tsunami that was generated from that offshore fault, and it sent a wave inland that, like I say, it actually created significant damage, and there was about 2,200 casualties. We can have the same thing happen along our shoreline. The same thing happens with these particular landslides. It pushes the tsunami inland. They don't anticipate those tsunamis hitting our shoreline in the worst case scenario to be taller than 9 to 12 feet. But as we saw in Japan, even 9 to 12 feet can push its way significantly inland. So there is what's been created through all the universities. USC, for instance, worked with several scientists in generating what they call a tsunami inundation map. And this tsunami inundation map is a determination scientifically how far inland, if one of these 9 to 12 foot tsunamis came to our shorelines, how far inland it would actually go and what kind of damage can be expected. And so with that inundation map, there is a dark red line that tells you how the furthest inland they expect it to go. And then there's a pink shaded area in there that will tell you where the tsunami is going to impact the people involved in that particular area.
So we have a tremendous amount of information about the nature of these events and the potential consequences, but very little about the timing.
That's the unfortunate thing. Any one of these could rupture at any given day. And in San Diego, for those of us that have lived here for a long period of time, you know that there hasn't been a great earthquake here for a long time. So the longer we go down here, we've seen the North Ridge, we had the Long Beach, we've had several significant earthquakes to the north of us in the LA area, but down here we haven't felt much of anything. A couple of Easters ago, we felt the one out of Mexico, and it rolled for about 45 seconds. That's the first activity we felt for a long period of time.
Well, actually, it's time for our first break, so we'll leave at that point of it's been a long time, it's going to happen soon, but we don't know when.
Sure.
That's called a teaser, I guess. While we're on a break, you'll be seeing an interview with Pat Abbott, who's a geology professor emeritus from SDSU. Stay with us.
What would we expect if the Rose Canyon Fault moved offshore? That means the movement of the fault is very close by. You're only 3 miles away, and depending where you are, inland a little bit, 5 miles away. And that means you're going to be subjected to all this high frequency, high shaking type of energy that's particularly effective or dangerous on single-story buildings and all. If you take your house, for example, it can go only so far before it goes back the other way. So your house is going to shake like this. The kinds of earthquake waves, seismic waves that dominate near the fault movement are these kind. So with these kinds of seismic waves and your house moving like this, when they get synchronized, that's maximum shaking for one-story buildings. For old brick buildings or things like that, these things are really, really dangerous. If you have any pre-1933 brick buildings, this is the event that's liable to bring them down. Now, if we go way out to the San Andreas Fault, which is going to be 80, 90 miles away, this kind of energy doesn't travel very far. In other words, it weakens with distance. The kind of energy that travels well for long distance are those rolling waves. Those are the kinds of things we felt in Easter last year on that earthquake in Mexico. Those kinds of seismic waves that take a long time to come through, they tend to make the tall buildings, bridges, large structures will tend to shake the most in the San Andreas earthquake. So what we're really looking at is, and I'm not saying what's going to fall, but I just say the San Andreas Fault, the tall buildings and tall structures will be shaken the most, relatively speaking. When the Rose Canyon Fault goes right offshore, it's primarily going to be the short buildings that feel most of that energy.
Welcome back to the Voice of Oceanside. We're talking earthquakes here. Chris, let's go to the famous one, the San Andreas Fault. What type of fault is that?
They actually refer to that as a strike-slip fault. It's very similar to the one that we just saw in Oklahoma that rattled that part of the country. It's also the same kind of a fault that we saw in Haiti. Actually, their fault line is exactly identical to ours, and they had a 7.8 magnitude. And one of the reasons it was so significant in its scope of damage and the deaths that were involved is they hadn't had a rupture for 220 years along that particular segment. And that kind of comes back into play where we are with our section of the San Andreas as well.
Well, give us some of the history.
Well, we know the San Andreas Fault is the longest fault line in the world. And it never starts from one section and goes the full 800 miles when it ruptures. It goes in 3 different segments. We have the northern section. The last time that ruptured was in 1906, the Great San Francisco earthquake. And that pretty much devastated most of the buildings there. It was considered a 7.7, though there is still some arguments over that. Some believe it was up to an 8.5. They didn't have as much sophistication in following the particular seismic activity at that particular point. So we see on the map, for instance, that northern section that ruptured in 1906. The midsection ruptured in 1857. And there weren't many deaths that occurred as a result of that particular earthquake. And the reason being is the population was fairly small at that particular time, but the damage was fairly significant. One of the things to point out in relationship to aftershocks is after that rupture in 1857, they logged in over 1,000 aftershocks in the first 3 months after that particular earthquake. And then we have the southern section, which hasn't ruptured since 1690, and that's the particular point that's of greatest concern to us. So we haven't seen a rupture there for over 320 years. So if you take out all the science in relationship to that, knowing that the San Andreas typically ruptures every 150 years, it only stands to reason that we expect this particular section down where we are to rupture next. There's no guarantees. We can't pick a date. Most scientists struggle to try and give you even a time frame involved. They tell you it could go off any day, it could go off 30 years from now. But it is of significant risk. Tom Rockwell, one of his associates at SDSU, said the San Andreas Fault is 10 months pregnant. I guess his way of describing how ripe we are and ready for that particular earthquake to rupture.
Now, there are myths, or I guess urban legends, about predictors or last-minute warnings. Any truth in any of those myths?
No, the most common one, especially where I'm from in the Midwest, is the assumption that the west of the San Andreas is going to fall into the ocean. And I think most people in Arizona would hope that would happen because they become closer to the coast. As a result of that, their property goes up in value. But the type of fault it is a strike slip fault. And those particular faults actually move side to side. There's no upward and downward movement that goes along with that. Like I'd mentioned before with the Japan earthquake, with that megathrust earthquake, it actually pushes down underneath the plate. And we actually have an image showing these tectonic plates and how they work. And we live to the west of the San Andreas. We live on what's called the Pacific Plate, as you can see right here. That's also connected to Japan. We see Hawaii in there. If you look right along the Pacific Plate and along the California coastline where the North American Plate is, that's where these two particular fault lines actually rub up against each other. But there's a side-to-side motion. Our particular plate is moving to the tune of 2 to 3 inches every year. And with that, it's moving on a northwest type of a basis. And as this particular ground is moving in this side-to-side motion, underneath us, about 30 to 50,000 feet, the only thing that's moving is the ground underneath us. So the earthquake is created on our end of this particular this strike zone is the fact that the upward surface has to catch up with the downward movement. So unlike that mega surge type of earthquake where it pushes, the mega thrust where it pushes underneath, this is moving side to side, so the ground upward has to catch up with the downward movement. So as a result, when this particular earthquake ruptures, they anticipate upward ground movement to be to the tune of 26 to 30 feet. And that's significant when you consider the movements going along all those particular cities, especially to the north of us.
Can we get a sense of the scope of this by using Katrina as a comparison, even though we're talking about two different kinds of natural disasters?
Absolutely. Los Angeles Times in September of 2005 actually ran an article saying that the next big Katrina, or the comparison to Katrina, would be a large earthquake in California. But in reality, if you want to run a comparison, Katrina from both sides of that particular hurricane impacted a total of 5 million people from one end to the next. The eye of the hurricane, where the greatest amount of destruction took place, involved 700,000 people. A rupture along our section of the San Andreas, which is 220 miles long, a stretch of 220 miles, if that ruptures from start to finish, it will impact 20 million people. And 6 million people will be in the direct path of destruction in its particular movement. So that's the difference in comparison between the two.
So it's a huge multiple worse.
Absolutely.
In other words. The issue beyond just the sheer size of it are some of the results. How do you scale that in terms of a Katrina, in terms of how long they were out of power? Again, we are going to have a follow-up show where we get into that in a little more detail. But just to give people a sense of scale, is it worse beyond just the fact that it's bigger? Does it also have worse consequences just because of the nature of the ground moving as opposed to wind blowing?
Absolutely. We have a video we want to show that's going to show the seismic activity from the actual San Andreas. And I understand that the image is not very clear. So if you go to our website, learntobeready.com, there's actually a good video clip there that you can actually play that will show you the amount of time in real time that particular earthquake is supposed to rupture. If it starts from the south and it works its way all the way to the northern section, we have this particular video right here, for instance. If it works its way up north from the south. We're going to watch this seismic activity continue to expand because the energy is building as it's moving its way north. By the way, it doesn't necessarily have to start from the south and work its way north. It can also start from the north and work its way south. If that's the case, there'll be much more seismic activity all the way down into Mexicali. But as this particular fault moves, you can see on the dotted line where that fault line lies. And one of the common things that people tell me is that after the San Andreas ruptures, they're going to load up their car, put some stuff in the trunk, and they're going to head out of the state. Well, I want you to take a good look at the map and realize where the three major freeways are in and out of this particular segment of California. And there's not going to be much left there that people are going to be able to travel on. Not only on the 15 do they anticipate the destruction from that upper ground movement of 26 to 30 feet, but that whole Cajon Pass is actually going to be destroyed with a landslide. So there's not going to be any road movement coming in and out of that particular freeway. So not only do we have the major roads in and out of here that will be impacted, but also the infrastructure within each of the cities is going to be impacted as well. Obviously more to the north than it is to the south. So in reality, San Diego and North County could be sitting pretty well in relationship to seismic damage and what comes from that from a structural standpoint, road-wise and building-wise. But they will receive...
But be isolated.
They will be isolated along with everybody else. Now, as this continues to shake, you're seeing it go into 2 minutes. Remember what I said earlier, the longer the fault line, the greater the shaking, and the greater the period of time that that shaking takes place. So going along that entire 220-mile stretch, if that happens, it's going to be in the 7.8 to 8.0 category, a seismic activity or a magnitude of earthquake. That's significant. And you're going to notice, even though the rupturing has stopped within that particular area, Los Angeles and Orange County continue to shake. And that's as a result of what's called... well, it's the sediment of the ground basically continues to shake, and it's going to act just like Jell-O, like a bowl of Jell-O does. It's going to continue to move and shake because of the type of ground that is there. The same thing's going to happen in the desert area, where it's called liquefaction. The liquefaction is going to cause that area, because of the water that's underneath, to mix with the ground, and it's going to continue to roll and shake for periods of time long after that particular quake stops shaking. So we see ourselves going into the 3-minute category, and there's still movement going on as a result of that quake.
And we haven't talked about aftershocks yet. This is still the actual initial event.
Absolutely.
So whether it starts from the south or the north, the particular part we're talking about here in North County is going to be isolated one way or another.
The California Earthquake Authority, by the way, in referring to aftershocks, is expecting over 10,000 aftershocks in the first 100 days after the San Andreas actually ruptures. And that's significant. When you go to Japan, for instance, in Japan, they had 900 aftershocks from March until June. 3 of those were greater than a 7.0, and 60 of those were greater than a 6.0. So in relationship to reestablishing or recovering from an earthquake, they got their power back on, but after every subsequent aftershock of significance, they continue to lose power, they continue to lose water, and every other resource that they needed to continue up there in Japan. So we're going to see a number of aftershocks that are going to basically hamper the ongoing efforts to get us back on our feet here in Southern California.
Now, you've given us a lot of information. We have about a minute left, and I know you do a lot of public speaking on this. So what's the sort of emotional takeaway that you want people to have? I know you're not trying to scare people. On the other hand, we need people to remember this. So can you give us a wrap-up?
Well, I'm trying not to be an alarmist. Sometimes my wife refers to me as the Grim Reaper, but all I'm really trying to do is convey information that's real. This isn't made-up stuff. This isn't stuff, a gut feel. This isn't what we may anticipate. This comes from a lot of research from several scientists and agencies that have pooled their information together. What we want you to do is to not walk in fear, but if you are truly prepared, if you know what's going to happen and you know what to expect, and you take the necessary steps to prepare, then the fear factor is taken away from it. If it happens, you work through your disaster plan. You work through the supplies that you've already established, knowing full well in advance what to expect. That's truly our goal, is to help everyone understand what they're going to expect, and then the next step is, how are you going to deal with it in the aftermath?
Well, Chris, that how you're going to deal with it is our next show, and I want to thank you for being here for this one. You've given us a lot of good information.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching this edition of The Voice of Oceanside. Remember, it is also available, downloadable from our website at koct.org.